Gobekli Tepe is older than farming, older than pottery, older than writing by 6,000 years. The pillars at the site are about 12 metric tons of carved stone set in perfect rings, raised by people the textbooks said had no civilization yet. For decades, archaeologists thought the builders were early Anatolian farmers caught at the exact moment civilization began. At least, that's what everyone thought. Then in 2022, 3 separate ancient DNA studies compared the local samples to every known Neolithic group, and the results matched none of them. But this story doesn't start with the DNA. It starts with a German archaeologist who spent the last 20 years of his life arguing that the textbooks were wrong about who built civilization and where it started. Klaus Schmidt started digging at Göbekli Tepe in 1995. He was working under the German Archaeological Institute, and he was chasing a lead nobody else thought was worth chasing. The site had been logged in 1963 by a joint Turkish-American survey team from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago. They walked across the hill, noted the scattered pieces of limestone, marked the spot as a prehistoric site, and moved on. Other nearby sites pulled the attention away. Gobekli Tepe sat untouched for the next 30 years. Schmidt read the survey report in 1994. He drove to the site himself. And within an hour of arriving, he understood that the 1963 team had walked past one of the most important archaeological finds in human history. The limestone pieces weren't a cemetery. They were the tops of pillars, huge T-shaped stones buried under 9 meters of built-up soil, set in stone circles one inside the next, carved with images of foxes and snakes and lions and vultures. Some of the pillars stood 5.5 meters tall, the largest weighed close to 20 metric tons, and the dating was wrong. Or rather, it was right, but it made no sense. Charcoal samples from the lowest dig layers came back at about 9,500 BCE. That's 11,500 years ago. To give you a sense of that, the pyramids at Giza were built around 2,500 BCE. Stonehenge went up around 3,000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe is older than both of those buildings by more than 6,000 years. It also came before farming in the Near East by at least 1,000 years. It came before pottery by about 3,000 years. It came before writing by 6,000. The people who cut those pillars from the rock, pulled them into place, carved them with myth-like images, and stood them up on purpose to line up with stars, had no farms. They had no tamed animals beyond the dog. They had no cities. They were, by every definition the textbooks used, hunter-gatherers. Except hunter-gatherers don't build temples. Schmidt spent the rest of his career arguing this point. He passed away in 2014, before the DNA data came in. He never got to see what the labs would find. While Schmidt was alive, the debate about Göbekli Tepe stayed inside archaeology. Who built it? When? Why? Most of his co-workers finally agreed that the dating was solid and the buildings were really Neolithic, but they argued the builders were probably early-stage farmers, groups changing from hunting-gathering to full farming. The Anatolian pre-pottery Neolithic period was complicated, and Göbekli Tepe could fit somewhere inside it without breaking the timeline. That was the agreed view when Schmidt passed. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In August 2022, the David Reich Laboratory at Harvard, working with partners across Europe and the Near East, published 3 linked papers in the journal Science. The lead author was Iosif Lazaridis, a DNA scientist who had spent more than 10 years rebuilding the family lines of ancient groups from the DNA in their bones. The combined work, published under the shared title The Genetic History of the Southern Ark, studied ancient DNA from over 700 people going from Anatolia through the Levant to the Iranian plateau. The samples covered about 10,000 years of early human history. The team's main goal was to map the DNA family lines of the Neolithic, the time when humans first started farming, building lasting villages, and laying the base of every civilization that would follow. They wanted to know where the farming groups came from, where they went, and how they connected to each other. Among the samples were people from Anatolian Neolithic sites in the same region as Göbekli Tepe. Banchuklu Hayuk, Ashukla Hayuk, Chatal Hayuk, Chayonu. Sites that were either from the same time as the Göbekli Tepe builders or came directly from their culture. The expected result was simple. The Anatolian Neolithic groups should look like a clean mix of the local hunter-gatherer ancestry that had been in the region for tens of thousands of years, and some input from nearby groups who had started the early days of farming. A DNA recipe with maybe 2 or 3 known parts, all of which should match groups the team already had matching data for. That's not what they found. Now, the scientists could have stopped there. They didn't. The Anatolian Neolithic samples had a big ancestry part that did not match any known group in the database. Not the Levantine pre-pottery Neolithic groups to the south, not the Iranian Neolithic groups to the east, not the European hunter-gatherers to the west, not the Caucasus hunter-gatherers to the north, not the older Anatolian samples the team had pulled from sites like Panarbasha, which dated to the Epi-Paleolithic. The signal was clearly Anatolian, clearly Neolithic, and clearly its own. The research started calling this ancestry the Anatolian hunter-gatherer part, but the name covered up the real problem. The team had found exactly one direct sample of a group that could have been the source of this ancestry. One person from the site of Panarbasha, dated to around 13,500 BCE, older than Gobeklitepe by 2,000 years, and that single sample was nowhere near enough to fill in the whole founder line the model needed. In other words, the DNA signal at the heart of the Anatolian Neolithic, the group that built Gobekli Tepe and its sister sites, goes back to a source group the DNA record can barely see. A people the database knows almost nothing about. A people whose only proven signs are a handful of bones and a cluster of stone pillars carved into the bedrock of southeastern Turkey. If you want to follow ancient mysteries like this one, hit subscribe. I cover lost civilizations, ancient DNA, and the gaps in the main record every week, and the next video is going to push this question further than this one does. While all of this was happening in the labs at Harvard, something else had been quietly going on back in southeastern Turkey for almost 10 years. In 2019, Turkish archaeologists working under the lead of Necmi Karul started heavy digging at a site called Karahan Tepe, about 35 kilometers east of Gobekli Tepe. The site had been on the survey maps since the 1990s, but Schmidt's project had pulled in most of the attention and most of the money. Karahan Tepe sat mostly undug until Karul's team arrived. What they found inside the first 3 seasons of digging changed the talk completely. Karahan Tepe had the same T-shaped pillars as Gobekli Tepe, the same star alignments, the same carvings of animals, the same building style, but Karahan Tepe also had something Gobekli Tepe didn't. A lowered room carved directly into the bedrock, surrounded by 11 phallic stones set in a planned half-circle, with a single carved human head coming out of the rock wall at one end. Scientists nicknamed it the Pillars Building. It was unlike anything Schmidt had found. By the 2024 dig season, Karul's team had logged more than 250 stones at Karahan Tepe, most of them T-shaped. In October 2025, they found a 135-centimeter tall pillar with a fully carved human face on its front side. The first time anywhere in the Tas Tepeler region that one of the T-pillars had been shown to be a real picture of a human figure. The pillars were not abstract signs, they were portraits, or something close to portraits. The meaning that the builders had been carving images of themselves, or of certain people among themselves, changed how we see the whole imagery of the site cluster. Karahan Tepe was followed by more sites: Saburs, Sefer Tepe, Kurt Tepesi, Harbatsuvan Tepesi. By 2023, the Turkish Ministry of Culture had grouped 12 proven sites under a single common name: Tas Tepeler, the Stone Hills, all within a 100-kilometer radius of Gobekli Tepe. All built by the same culture, all dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic, with the earliest building stages pushing back toward 10,000 BCE and possibly earlier. This wasn't one odd temple, it was a regional civilization. A web of huge sites spread across an area about the size of Connecticut, built by a people the DNA database could barely identify. And the DNA work kept going in the background. Later studies from sites in the Tas Tepeler region, along with samples from Chayonu Tepesi and Nevalu Chori, both of which lie inside the same cultural group, kept returning the same odd signal. The ghost ancestry didn't fade as more data came in. It became sharper, more clear, and harder to explain. For a while, the regional DNA picture actually seemed to make sense. The standard model held that the Anatolian hunter-gatherer part was just the deep ancestry of the local Paleolithic group. People who had lived in southeastern Turkey for tens of thousands of years before anyone started building stone pillars. The model said the local hunter-gatherers slowly changed into the Neolithic, picked up farming over generations, and finally built sites like Gobekli Tepe as part of that slow cultural growth. That model fit the early data. It stopped fitting around 2023. The problem was the timing. The DNA signal at the heart of the Anatolian Neolithic didn't show the slow mixing pattern you'd expect from a group slowly changing into farming. It showed something closer to a sudden appearance. The ancestry seemed to arrive in the regional gene pool already formed, already separate. As if a group had moved into the area, added a huge amount to the DNA base of everything that came after, and then either spread out or disappeared from the DNA record before anyone could directly sample them. Some scientists started using the term founder line to describe the signal. Others used ghost ancestry. The names were different, the meaning was the same. The people whose bones built the model were not in the model. They had left their DNA fingerprint on everyone who came after, but the bodies themselves were missing. You'd think someone in the field would have flagged that gap by now. The field hasn't. That detail would come back to haunt the scientists. Because if you accept the ghost group reading, the question stops being about Gobekli Tepe exactly, and becomes about something much bigger. Who were these people? Where did they come from? And what happened to them? There is a real, published, peer-reviewed answer that part of the field is willing to defend. It goes like this. The ghost ancestry stands for a group that lived in southeastern Anatolia during the late Pleistocene, the cold, dry time that ended around 12,000 years ago. The Younger Dryas, as climate scientists call it, was a sudden switch back in global warming that locked the northern hemisphere into about 1,200 years of near ice age conditions. It ended suddenly around 9,700 BCE. Within a few generations, the climate of southeastern Anatolia changed from cold steppe to mild forest. Wild grain plants exploded. Game animals returned in numbers not seen for thousands of years. Whatever group was living through that change would have lived through one of the biggest environmental shifts in human history. And the first stone pillars at Göbekli Tepe go into the ground inside the first 2 centuries of that new climate. They were hunter-gatherers, technically, but they were already living in semi-lasting villages, already managing wild grain crops without fully taming them, already building ritual structures in stone. And when the climate warmed at the end of the Younger Dryas, they spread out. They spread their culture and their genes across the region. They added to the groups that would later build Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and the rest of the Tas Tepeler sites. And then, over the next few thousand years, they were absorbed into the bigger Neolithic farming groups that grew out of their own legacy. That's the careful reading. The one most archaeologists are okay defending in print. But careful isn't the same as complete. And even the careful reading raises a question the field has not answered. If this group was building stone temples and managing wild grain crops at 10,000 BCE, why have we found almost no trace of them before Gobekli Tepe? Their sites should be older. Their tools should be older. The DNA signal should appear in samples that come before the Great Stone Complex by 1,000 years or more. It doesn't. The ghost group shows up in the DNA record at almost exactly the moment the first pillars went into the ground. 3 years later, a smaller follow-up study tried to push back the dating window. Scientists from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology looked at microscopic strontium isotope ratios in tooth enamel from a few Anatolian pre-pottery Neolithic remains. The ratio should have shown whether the people had grown up locally or arrived from somewhere else. The results were unclear. A few samples matched the regional bedrock signature, others didn't. The pattern fit with a mixed group, partly local, partly from somewhere else. Where that somewhere else was, the isotope data couldn't say. Then a separate science group came forward with something more solid. Dr. Lee Clare, the current scientific director of the Gobekli Tepe project, gave a 2023 interview in which he confirmed that the site had more human remains than the early dig reports had said. Not full burials, pieces, skull pieces, mostly, found in fill layers inside the stone rings. A 2017 study by Julia Gresky had already logged some of them. The pieces showed marks made on purpose after death, grooves cut into the bone, drill holes, traces of ochre. The scientists called it a skull cult. What the name actually means, in archaeology, is that the people of Gobekli Tepe were doing something specific with the remains of their dead. Something ritual, something organized, something we still don't understand. And the timing of what happened next was almost too perfect. The second paper in the Lazaridis set, titled Ancient DNA from Mesopotamia, suggests distinct pre-pottery and pottery Neolithic migrations into Anatolia dropped a finding that broke the local origin model entirely. The samples that anchored it were a first for the field. 3 people from the site of Göbekli Tarla in Mardin, southeastern Turkey, dated to the early pre-pottery Neolithic. 2 more from Nemrut in northern Iraq, dating to a similar window. Together, those 5 skeletons were the first ancient DNA ever pulled from Mesopotamia. The cradle of civilization, as the older textbooks called it, had until that paper been a DNA black box. The Lazaridis team had opened it for the first time, and the DNA inside did not say what the usual model expected it to say. The Anatolian pre-pottery Neolithic groups, the people whose culture had built and inherited Gobeklitepe, were not pure descendants of the local hunter-gatherers. Their DNA carried big ancestry from a group further east, in what is now northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey, Mesopotamian-related ancestry. Ancestry that had moved north and west into Anatolia in 2 separate waves, the first of which arrived in the centuries around the building of Göbekli Tepe itself. That finding went against decades of agreement. The standard view was that farming and huge buildings in Anatolia had grown in place from the local group. The 2022 paper said something different. A wave of people from Mesopotamia, or somewhere closer to it, had moved into southeastern Anatolia right around the time the first pillars were going into the ground. And here is where the deeper signal gets uncomfortable. When scientists studied the Mesopotamian source group itself, it didn't come down to a clean local line either. It also showed traces of an ancestry that DNA scientists call basal Eurasian. Basal Eurasian is an ancestry part scientists have only ever guessed at, one that group studies have been pointing to for over 10 years. It stands for a guessed-at human line that branched off from the rest of non-African humanity tens of thousands of years ago, gave ancestry to Neolithic groups across the Near East, and then disappeared from the DNA record. No scientist has ever directly sampled it. They have only ever seen its shadow. The people of Gobekli Tepe carry that shadow. So do their Mesopotamian cousins. So do their descendants across the Anatolian Neolithic and the European farming spread that followed. If the guess holds, and the basal Eurasian signal really is sitting at the base of the group that built Göbekli Tepe, the field is looking at one of the closest brushes with a missing chapter of early human history we have ever come across. A group the textbooks don't have a name for. A people who added to the founding group of one of the first huge sites in human history, then faded back into the gene pool before anyone wrote anything down about them. In 10 years, archaeologists would understand exactly what this means. The skull cult, the ghost ancestry, the regional Tas Tepeler complex, the lack of older sites that should be there if the careful model is right, all of it points in the same direction. There was a culture in southeastern Anatolia at the end of the Ice Age that was doing things the textbooks said couldn't be done, building in stone, managing the land they lived on, doing ritual practices around the dead, carrying a DNA signal the rest of the Neolithic would inherit but never copy. That culture didn't fit into the late Pleistocene. It didn't fit neatly into the early Neolithic. It sat in the gap between them, in the short window of steady climate after the Younger Dryas ended, and it built one of the most ambitious building projects of the early world. Then it vanished. Someone buried the pillars at Gobekli Tepe on purpose, sometime around 8000 BCE. They filled in the site, covered it over, hid it. The people who had inherited it, or maybe the people who had built it, we don't know. Burying the site kept it safe. It also erased it from the history record for the next 10,000 years. Until Klaus Schmidt walked across the hill in 1994 and noticed the limestone pieces the Chicago survey team had ignored. What survived is the work itself. 12 proven sites across the Tas Tepeler region, hundreds of pillars, some weighing 20 metric tons, carved with images we still don't fully understand. A DNA signal scattered across every Neolithic group that came from the people who built them. Pieces of skulls marked in ritual patterns we can describe but can't read. And the entries in 3 science papers from 2022 that map a founder line to a starting point the database does not have. The textbook said civilization started in Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. The textbooks are off by at least 6,000 years and about 1,000 kilometers. The first civilization, if we can call it that, was built by a people whose bones we have barely found, whose language we will never hear, and whose DNA ancestry we are still trying to rebuild from the descendants they left behind. They had no writing, they had no farms, they had no name we know. They had stone, sky, and the dead. They used those 3 things to build the oldest temple in the world. And then they walked away from it? What lasts 11,500 years later is a hill in southeastern Turkey, a DNA signal nobody can fully trace, and a set of questions the field has not yet earned the right to answer. The pillars are still there. They are still standing. They are still pointing at the same stars they were pointing at in 9500 BCE. The people who raised them are not.